It was the afternoon of November 15th, 2001 in Austin, Texas, a place where the sun shines almost 300 days a year. But this was not one of those days. Something ominous hung in the air. Suddenly, the wind began to grow stronger. Terrifying black clouds covered the sky, completely blocking out the light. In an instant, day turned into night, and a downpour began with deafening thunderclaps and blinding lightning. Austin probably hadn't seen weather like this in about 7 years. As if that weren't enough, a tornado warning was issued for a tornado moving toward the city. At the same time, in a northwestern suburb, 43-year-old Diane Holick was working in her cozy home office. She was a project manager at IBM. When a friend warned Diane that a tornado was heading in her direction, the woman became very frightened because she had grown up in New York and had never encountered anything like that before. Nevertheless, she said she simply wouldn't go outside and that everything would be fine. The storm raged and roared all night. In the morning, the downpour finally stopped lashing against the windows. The sky began to clear, and it became very quiet. Residents hurried to contact their relatives and friends to check how they had weathered the storm, but no one was able to reach Diane. Her friend and neighbor, Lockie Brown, a real estate agent, went to Diane's house, but no one answered the door. By noon, a colleague from Dallas had already called her 8 times. A video conference had been scheduled at work, but Diane did not join. She would never have reached such a high position if she weren't a responsible person, so as her colleague grew increasingly worried that the tornado might have damaged Diane's house or injured her, she contacted the police. Lockie Brown noticed the police officers arriving and, since she had a key, offered to let them in. As soon as she stepped inside, a chill ran down her spine. Something had clearly happened because the marks on the carpet showed that the dogs hadn't been taken out for a walk for quite some time. Diane would never have allowed that. Lockie was right. Upstairs in the guest bedroom, they discovered the lifeless body of the homeowner. The homicide detectives who arrived at the scene immediately noticed that, compared with most crime scenes, this one looked surprisingly clean. Everything was in its place, and you had to enter the bedroom and even walk around the bed to notice the woman at all. She was lying at a strange angle, as if someone had tried to hide her under the bed, but failed. The doors were locked and the windows were untouched. The woman was fully clothed, and nothing suggested that she had been sexually assaulted. Some of her jewelry was still on her as well. Everything looked so unusual that the detectives didn't immediately believe a murder had taken place. It even crossed their minds that the woman might have taken her own life, and that afterward one of her friends had found her, arranged her body in that position, and tidied up the house to protect her family from emotional trauma. However, a closer examination of the body revealed a far more horrifying picture of what had happened. There were marks from zip ties on Diane's wrists and a very deep ligature mark from strangulation around her neck. Near the bedroom, stains from mascara and lipstick were found on the carpet, and there was an abrasion on the woman's cheek from being dragged across it. In other words, the killer, whoever it was, had restrained Diane with zip ties and strangled her near the bedroom, then dragged her into the room. After that, he or she carefully cleaned the house. But the perfect cleanliness was disrupted by one detail that didn't fit the scene: a towel lying on a chair near the front door. The forensic team took it for analysis, though they feared it might not be enough to lead them to the killer. When a beautiful woman is murdered, the investigation often begins with the men closest to her. With her charming smile and almost childlike spontaneity, Diane attracted people like a magnet. She had many friends, both women and men, but she always valued her independence and self-sufficiency and didn't get into very serious relationships. However, after turning 40, Diane decided that she wanted to get married and start a family like her friends. That was when she met Dennis Conley, a divorced father of 2 and a successful businessman who had moved to Houston. He treated her like a queen and sincerely cared for the woman he loved. Soon he asked the very question Diane had dreamed of hearing. She happily agreed to marry him and decided to sell her house so she could move to Houston. Diane enlisted the help of Lockie Brown, but the real estate market was going through difficult times. Several potential buyers came to see the house, but no one had purchased it yet. On Friday, the day after the murder, Dennis left many messages for the woman. On the one hand, it looked as though he was very worried. On the other hand, could he have been creating an alibi for himself? After several unsuccessful attempts by the police to reach Dennis, the detectives began to wonder whether he might have been involved in the murder, especially since his gift, a platinum ring worth $20,000, was one of the few items missing. When the police finally managed to contact Dennis, he immediately came to Austin. The man answered questions clearly and quite openly. He admitted that there had been difficulties in his relationship with Diane because she was very independent. They had even decided to postpone the wedding, but they had been seeing a family counselor who helped resolve their disagreements. Dennis agreed to provide fingerprints and DNA samples. He said that on the day of the murder, he had spoken with Diane on the phone, but had spent the evening in Houston. The man said he couldn't think of anyone who might have held a grudge against her, but he noted that the police should talk to Ray, her colleague, who had never hidden his feelings for her. Raphael Chauncey, or Ray, didn't even have to be searched for. The concerned colleague showed up at the crime scene himself. He said he hadn't been able to reach Diane by phone and had come to check on her. What caught the investigators' attention was how eager the man was to help the investigation. He was practically bending over backward to be useful. During the conversation, he didn't deny at all that he liked Diane very much, but she did not return his feelings. Diane herself had recently admitted to a friend that she should probably distance Ray a little because his persistent attention was starting to cross boundaries. Nevertheless, Diane saw him more often than her fiancé because they worked together. When she was away, Ray even walked her dogs. This meant that he had a key to Diane's house. However, he also had an alibi. On Thursday, the day of the murder, he had been at work, which was fully confirmed. After crossing one suspect off their list, the investigators once again turned their attention to her fiancé, especially since he had done something unthinkable that turned all of Diane's loved ones against him. While the investigation was ongoing, the day of Diane's farewell arrived. Her parents had taken her body back to New York. No one expected what would happen next. Dennis arrived accompanied by a priest and, without saying a word to anyone, held a wedding ceremony with the deceased Diane, placing a gold ring on her finger. After that, the man didn't even speak to any of the woman's relatives or friends who were present. This made her parents incredibly angry, and they removed the ring from their daughter's finger. They were outraged, and Diane's friends were already convinced that the man was involved in the murder. But no matter how insane his actions seemed, Dennis also turned out to be innocent. His alibi was confirmed, and he had spent the day of the murder in Houston. The investigation had reached a dead end, but it was a colleague of Diane who helped move it forward. She remembered Diane saying that she might have found a buyer for the house. Even if she hadn't moved to Houston to be with her fiancé, she still wanted to find a smaller home. So on the day she died, the house was still listed for sale. Diane had told her colleague that a potential buyer had come to see it. He was wearing expensive clothes and seemed harmless, so she wasn't afraid to let him in without the realtor present. The man had recently sold a ranch and planned to pay Diane in cash from the proceeds. He promised that he would return later with his wife and assured her that his wife would like the house as well. So the police now had another suspect. The question was how to find him. The investigators came up with the idea that the potential buyer might also have visited other houses in the same neighborhood. They were right. About 7 women said that on the day of the murder, a man had come to their homes asking to see the house without a realtor. When all these witnesses were invited to the station and began entering one after another, the detectives were stunned by what looked like a parade of very beautiful women who all resembled each other and were about the same age. It became clear that the suspect had a specific type and that he was targeting women who stayed home with their children while their husbands or boyfriends were at work. The stakes had now risen significantly because the police believed they were looking for the perfect stranger. Most of the women refused to let the man in, but one of them, who was herself a realtor, was not afraid to allow him inside. She almost immediately regretted that decision. He seemed nervous, didn't turn on the lights anywhere, and didn't open doors, as if he wasn't particularly interested in the house. Then he went upstairs and kept calling her to come up, asking various questions. The woman realized he was trying to lure her into her own bedroom, so she shouted answers from downstairs and stubbornly refused to go up. Eventually, the stranger left, but he gave the woman his name, Walter Miller, and a phone number. While she helped create a composite sketch, The police checked that name in their databases. The database contained two people named Walter Miller, but both were far too old to match the suspect. Checking the phone number produced a more interesting lead. The number actually belonged to a man named Matt Sapowski, who had previously been charged with domestic violence and drug offenses. The detectives went to Matt's home, convinced they had found their suspect, but instead discovered a man who was practically immobile. Sometime before the murder, Matt had been in a serious accident and was essentially incapacitated. There was no way he could have killed Diane. Fortunately, the work on the suspect's composite sketch paid off. Within 10 minutes of it being shown on TV, a woman called and said that he had come to her house as well. This had happened 6 months earlier, and he had been very insistent on getting inside. She refused, and he left, but returned a few months later. Again, she refused to let him in without a realtor, which made him extremely angry. The stranger shouted at her, but she stood her ground. The incident had frightened her so much that when he left, she grabbed a pen and paper and wrote down his license plate number. The car belonged to 37-year-old Patrick Anthony Russo. At first glance, he didn't match the suspect's image. He was a married father of two who played in a Christian music group and performed at church. But the same Tony Russo had been a suspect in multiple attacks on women, attempting to strangle them. For one of these incidents, he had been sentenced to 20 years, but was released early after 8. The investigators went to speak with the man. Naturally, he didn't live on a ranch, but in a modest house outside Austin. He agreed to go in for questioning, and while he was away, the police searched his home but found nothing linking him to the murder. At the station, Russo explained that on Thursday at 4 p.m., he had gone to the Christian radio station in Austin to promote his group. He had knocked, but no one answered, and he left. Russo denied scouting the new house and didn't even react when shown Diane's photo. The police had to release him. However, the station manager, when interviewed, said that he knew Russo and had not seen him that day. Moreover, with the tornado approaching, any visitor would have been impossible to miss. According to protocol, when a tornado warning is issued, everyone must move to the lobby and open doors to equalize the morning air pressure. The entrance was clearly visible, so anyone approaching the station could not have gone unnoticed. So Russo had lied, and the police could detain him. It was a minor offense, but it allowed them to continue working on the case without fearing that he might attack someone else. And they got lucky. Another young mother called the police saying she might have evidence against the suspect. While her husband was at work, a man had knocked at her door with a flyer about selling her house. He asked if he could come in, and she let him. He was polite, asked about the dog, security systems, and the children. They walked through the house, and when they entered the bedroom, he suddenly turned toward her. In an instant, he transformed from a man into a monster. His gaze gave him away. The woman was sure he was about to attack her, but at that moment, a baby's cry came from the baby monitor. She quickly turned and rushed to her child. The stranger followed her, but seeing the infant in her arms, he bolted, leaving behind an important piece of evidence. Acting on instinct, the woman put the flyer in a closet, and when she later saw the composite sketch on TV, she called the police. Tony Russo had claimed that he had never scouted a house and that none of his fingerprints would appear anywhere, but laboratory analysis proved otherwise. 4 of Tony Russo's fingerprints were found on the flyer, and this young mother could have been his first victim. The women whom Russo had visited under the pretense of viewing real estate identified him. Phone records connected him to Diane's neighborhood. In addition, several hairs were found on the towel discovered in her home. Since they were rootless, a 100% DNA analysis was impossible, but partial testing showed a match with Russo's DNA. However, the suspect confessed to nothing, and prosecutors worried that this evidence alone might not be enough for a conviction. Then investigators had an idea. Perhaps he had been searching online for houses for sale. Examining his computer revealed far more than they had expected. They discovered his motive. It turned out that he visited disturbing websites. In particular, he had a paid subscription to a very specific site that showcased the darkest erotic fantasies of men. The last video he had viewed depicted a man who, under the pretense of buying real estate, enters a woman's home, strangles her, deriving sexual pleasure from the act of murder, and then steals her valuables, making it appear as a robbery gone wrong. At Anthony Russo's trial, the prosecutor recounted that day in a highly emotional manner to the jury. Russo likely first visited Diane on Thursday morning, telling her he would return later with his wife. He did return during the storm, carrying everything he needed for the attack. Diane, of course, let him in and even offered him a towel to dry his hair. Suddenly, he attacked her from behind and restrained her with zip ties so she could not resist. The victim had to wait in terror while he prepared his murder weapon, some kind of rope or similar item. He then strangled her. The prosecutor asked the jury to imagine him holding his hands up, as if gripping her neck, emphasizing that Diane, tied up, could not fight back, scratch, or resist. He held her for 3 minutes at minimum, watching life drain from her with every second. He repeated to the jury how long this must have felt and what she must have experienced. The jury visualized this horrifying scene and found Anthony Russo guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and will not be eligible for parole until the age of 93. All his appeals have failed, and he continues to serve his sentence. It is sad to realize that Diane's openness, friendliness, and kindness ultimately led to such a tragic outcome. Yet there is true admiration in how a group of women who had never met each other but had each encountered the predator scouting victims came together to prevent him from attacking anyone else. If it weren't for these women recognizing him, noting his license plate, and preserving the flyer, the case might never have been solved. Tony Russo almost certainly would have tried again and again, driven by his thirst to kill.